I managed to buy a severely wounded merman at a bargain price. The seller warned me that he was incredibly stubborn, he refused to sing, and he wouldn't shed a single tear. Yet, as I looked at the merman currently humming a soft tune and crying at the slightest provocation, I couldn't help but wonder if they had sent me the wrong creature. Later on, he kept plucking his own scales and presenting them to me, looking incredibly anxious, as if he couldn't stand being near me. Once his wounds healed, I drove him to the shore and released him into the wild. But the merman burst into tears. Giving you my scales was a courtship ritual. Courtship. For heaven's sake, you didn't release me, you abandoned me. He was a terribly battered creature. The shipping crate was far too small for his frame. He was curled up in a pitiful ball, his hands bound tightly behind his back with heavy leather straps. A cheap plastic muzzle was fastened over his face, and a bright yellow tag was punched through his webbed ear, stamped with his serial number, 531. His silver tail, which must have been magnificent once, had lost all its luster, the scales dull and chipped. After confirming the delivery, I signed the electronic receipt. From this day forward, he was mine. As I reached out to lift him from the crate, his eyes snapped open, and a low, warning growl rumbled from his chest. Those ice-blue eyes were filled with absolute defiance and sharp hostility. I froze for a moment, my mind drifting. The color of his eyes was identical to the merman I had met once when I was a child. That was why, when my best friend Serena sent me the discount link, I had purchased him without a second thought. I quickly cleaned his shallow cuts, and the moment I unbuckled his restraints, he scrambled out of my hands and dove straight into the indoor pool. I had already prepared the water, adjusting the salt levels to match the ocean. I pulled a fresh slab of salmon from the refrigerator, walked over to the edge of the pool, and said simply, "Eat." He swam closer, slowly rising from the water, and reached his hand out toward me. If I had known anything about marine biology, I would have recognized that this was a classic predatory stance. Unfortunately, I only realized this when a sharp, stinging pain sliced across my forearm. My silver beaded bracelet snapped under the pressure, the beads scattering into the water. Luckily, my reflexes were quick enough that I managed to pull back, escaping with only a shallow scratch. A tiny bead of crimson welled up on my skin, dripping into the pool and blooming like a red flower in the water. The merman's nostrils flared. He stared at the dissolving blood, completely still. Looking at his stunned expression, I wondered if he hadn't meant to hurt me. Perhaps human skin was simply too fragile compared to what he was used to. I let out a soft sigh, went to patch up my arm, and decided it was finally time to read the digital manual the seller had emailed me. Mermen and humans do not share a language. Communication requires extreme patience. Mermen can survive on land, but they require regular skin hydration and must supplement their diet with extra fresh water. This species is naturally hostile. The success of domestication varies wildly by individual. For the owner's safety, we highly recommend keeping them in a glass enclosure during the initial stages. Direct physical contact is not advised. Some mermen possess the ability to shift their tails into human legs. The shop is not responsible if your merman escapes using this method. Should you choose to view your merman as a romantic partner, there is no reproductive isolation between our species. Please note, a merman's physical strength and endurance far exceed those of an average human. And that was it? Frustrated, I opened the chat window to contact customer support, sending over my order number. The representative replied almost instantly. "Hello, dear customer. As stated on the product page, this particular specimen is a clearance item. He refuses to sing, refuses to communicate, and refuses to produce pearls. He has a highly antisocial personality. We only recommend him as a budget-friendly companion for the bedroom. We do not accept returns or refunds if your complaint is about his lack of singing or pearl production." I typed back, I was scratched by the merman. "Do I need to worry about contracting Vibrio vulnificus?" The representative replied, "Don't worry, dear. All our specimens undergo thorough medical sterilization before shipping." I thought about it, then added, "I tried feeding him raw salmon, but he won't touch it. Does he have a specific diet?" "Support, theoretically, they can eat anything humans eat. He might just be stressed by the new environment, or perhaps he doesn't like it raw. Try cooking it." "Cooking it? Do wild mermen carry stoves around in the ocean?" Though skeptical, I asked, "How well done should it be?" After a short pause, the representative replied, "Tiny thinks medium rare should do the trick." I stared at the screen. Who is Tiny? Is she a marine expert? The screen flashed, "Oh, dear, Tiny is just me. Sending love." Unable to find any gourmet recipes for marine life on the internet, I simply seared the salmon in a pan until it was slightly pink in the middle. Walking back to the pool, I used a pair of chopsticks to pick up a piece, chewing it slowly in front of him. "It's safe to eat," I said. He floated up to the edge, the water pooling around his collarbones. He kept his head lowered, water dripping from his thick eyelashes, as his hands slowly broke the surface. Only then did I see what he was holding, the broken beads of my silver bracelet. He had recovered every single one of them from the bottom of the pool. He gently deposited the silver beads into my open palm, offering me a sweet, timid smile. He looked like an entirely different creature from the wild beast of earlier. I stared at him, thinking that Tiny was actually right. He really did prefer his salmon seared. "Thank you," I said, offering a soft smile. He gave his silver tail a happy swish, looking quite pleased with himself. After putting the beads aside, I picked up the chopsticks again and held a piece of salmon in front of him. He looked at me, making no move to take it with his hands. Instead, he tilted his head up and parted his lips, waiting for me to feed him. I leaned closer, placing the fish in his mouth. The next second, his eyes went wide. He scrambled backward through the water, his eyes turning red instantly. He covered his mouth with the back of his hand, his throat moving as if he wanted to spit it out but was too afraid to do so. Tears welled up in his eyes, finally spilling over his cheeks. A shower of round, perfect pearls clattered into the water. I blinked. The relationship between land and sea had suddenly become incredibly tense. What's wrong? I grabbed his chin, gently forcing him to look at me. Open your mouth. He looked at me pitifully, slowly parting his lips and sticking out the pink tip of his tongue. A merman's mouth was structured slightly differently from a human's, possessing a strange, exotic beauty. The tip of his tongue was slightly red. He had burned himself. I stared at him. The seller had claimed he never cried, but he seemed incredibly delicate to me. Perhaps the sensation of heat was entirely foreign to him, which was why he had reacted so dramatically. I waited for the rest of the salmon to cool completely before feeding him again. This time, he seemed to enjoy it. Once he finished, my gaze fell on the yellow tag in his ear. I had fully intended to release him back into the wild once his wounds healed, so there was no real need to give him a proper name. Still, I hated referring to him as a number. Caspian, I said, looking into his eyes. From now on, your name is Caspian. He tilted his head, likely not understanding the words, but he swam closer to the edge, resting his chin on the tiled deck and looking up at me. Caspian? So he could speak. I remembered the manual mentioning that mermen needed freshwater intake. I brought over a glass of water, but he turned his head away in disgust, refusing to drink. I had to message support again. Tiny explained that in the wild, mermen obtained their freshwater from the bodies of live prey. If the fish wasn't completely fresh, they would suffer from mild dehydration. Because they only associated water with salt water, they would never willingly drink fresh water from a cup. Realizing the issue, I went to the freezer and scooped a cup of ice. I poured the ice cubes into my palm, holding them out to him. Caspian swam closer, his hands rising from the water. But instead of taking the ice, he gently wrapped his cold fingers around my wrist. Holding me in place, he leaned down, carefully picking up an ice cube with his lips. His soft lips brushed against my palm, sending a slight tickle up my arm. Crunch, crunch. The sound of him crushing the ice between his sharp teeth was incredibly crisp and clear. He seemed to love it, the cold temperature bringing him instant comfort. A single ice cube remained in my palm, slowly melting from my body heat. The cold water began to trickle down the lines of my hand. Seeing this, as if loath to let any of it go to waste, Caspian leaned down again. He extended his tongue, licking the water clean from my palm. Then, following the trail of moisture, his lips pressed a soft, cold kiss against my forearm. Because of the ice, his mouth and tongue were freezing against my warm skin. My fingers twitched. Finally, he took the last piece of ice, his eyes narrowing in pure bliss. I handed him the rest of the cup, and he finished every single cube. Do you like it, Caspian? I asked. He tilted his head, processing the question for a long time. Suddenly, a look of realization washed over his face, and he flipped backward, diving deep into the pool. When he emerged, he held a handful of shimmering pearls, dropping them one by one into the empty cup. Like? He pointed to the glittering pearls, then to his own bright, ice-blue eyes, looking at me with intense anticipation. Like? His silver tail swished gently beneath the water. I gently shook the cup, the pearls clinking against the glass. Did he think like referred to things that were bright, beautiful, and cold, like the ice, the pearls, and his own eyes? It seemed he hadn't quite grasped the human definition of the word. Seeing the hope in his eyes, I slowly shook my head. No, that's not what it means. Caspian's face fell, and his silver tail drooped listlessly beneath the surface. Over the next few days, I began teaching him simple vocabulary. Vi, 6, and Caspian practiced, pronouncing each syllable of my name with careful precision. I smiled, nodding. Yes. I am Vivian. And you are Caspian. Cass, Pi, and... He didn't repeat his own name. Instead, he murmured mine again. Vi, 6, and... A happy ripple went through his tail, and he swished it back and forth. Vivian. Vivian. I let out a soft sigh. His communication skills were currently below those of an average sheepdog. Since Caspian could move around on land, and he constantly tried to climb into my bed, I ended up ordering a specialized hydrogel mattress for him. The surface was cool, soft, and slick to the touch. When you pressed your hand into it, it would leave a deep impression before slowly bouncing back. I called Caspian over, lying down on the gel mattress to show him how to use it. This is your bed. I stood up, gesturing for him to try. He reached out a finger, touching the cool surface. The moment his finger sank into the gel, his eyes lit up. He dragged his entire body onto the mattress, burying his face in the cool material, his tail shivering with pure delight. Then, he looked up at me, shifting his tail to make a small, circular space on the mattress. He patted the empty space with his tail, urging me to join him. No, thank you, I declined. I have my own bed. The hydrogel mattress was far too soft for a human. It offered zero lumbar support, making me feel like I was sinking into a swamp. I went to my own bed, assuming I would finally get a peaceful night's sleep. But when the lights went out, I felt a shadow looming over me. I opened my eyes to see Caspian standing by my bedside, looking down at me like a giant, obedient puppy. I tried to reason with him. You have your own bed now. Go sleep over there. He tilted his head, pretending not to understand a word, his silver tail swishing silently in the dark. He seemed to believe that every flat surface in the house belonged to him. Sighing, I pulled back the covers. Fine. Get in. Without a second's hesitation, he slithered onto the mattress, wrapping his arms tightly around my waist. He rested his chin on the crown of my head, his long tail curling around my legs to lock me in place. He let out a deep, satisfied sigh. Did he truly not understand me? Or did he simply choose to understand only the things he wanted to hear? Still, his scales were smooth and cool against my skin, acting like a perfect, natural cooling pad. I let him stay. I don't know how many hours passed before I was jolted awake by a sudden, intense heat. I opened my eyes to find that the cool, soothing merman had turned into a literal furnace. His cheeks were flushed red, his mouth slightly parted, his lips a dark, swollen crimson. Sensing that I was awake, he pressed his hot body even closer, his tail wrapping tightly around my thighs. Let go, Caspian. You're boiling, I said, shoving at his chest without a shred of gratitude for his earlier service. He refused to budge. He cupped my face with his burning hands, leaning down to press a soft kiss against my cheek. Then, he took my hand and pressed it flat against his chest. Beneath the hot skin, his heart was hammering at a frantic, terrifying pace. He looked down at me with watery, pathetic eyes, looking as if he were about to burst into tears at any second. Vivian. His voice was thick and raspy. Finally, a light bulb went off in my head. I wrapped one arm around his waist and the other under his tail, lifting him off the bed. Caspian looked momentarily stunned by the Princess Carrie. But he quickly accepted his new position, resting his heavy head against my collarbone and nuzzling his face into my neck. I carried him over to the indoor pool. And threw him straight in. The manual had clearly stated that mermen could survive on land, but they required regular hydration. His high body temperature and raspy voice were obvious signs of severe dehydration. In the water, Caspian stared up at me with utter betrayal in his eyes. Seeing that I remained unmoved, he began to swim in frantic circles, churning the water into a froth. See? He was clearly dehydrated. The moment he hit the water, he was so happy he was doing laps. Eventually, Caspian retreated to the furthest corner of the pool, turning his back to me as he silently began to weep pearls. I nodded in satisfaction. Ah, tears of joy. The next morning, before I was fully awake, I felt a cool hand gently playing with my fingers. Opening my eyes, I looked down toward the floor. Caspian was lying on the hardwood floor beside my bed. He was holding my hand up, twisting my fingers between his own. The floor around him was covered in a thick layer of shimmering pearls, and he was glaring up at me with a look of pure resentment. I had no idea how long he had been lying there. I sat up on the edge of the bed, feeling a headache coming on. While the pearls were incredibly valuable, there was currently no safe place to put my feet. I could already see the slipping hazard. I used my foot to clear a small patch of floor. Clean these up, Caspian. Every single one. His expression became even more miserable. By the time I finished my morning routine and prepared to leave for work, he was still on his hands and knees, picking them up one by one. I ended up working much later than expected. When I finally unlocked the front door, the apartment was completely dark. As I flipped the light switch, I froze. Every single container, bowl, glass, and vase in the house had been filled to the brim with shimmering, high-quality pearls. I stared at the sparkling piles. What had he done? Had he secretly sold my house while I was gone? I finally found him on his hydrogel bed. He had dragged my heavy duvet down from the bedroom, wrapping himself in it like a cocoon, leaving only the very tip of his silver tail exposed. Scattered around him were several sweaters and shirts I wore regularly. I stared at the mess. I actually needed to wear those clothes, and he was using them to build a nest. Beside the bed, a glass cup piled high with pearls began to slide. A single pearl rolled off the top, clattering onto the floor. The single pearl rolled off the top of the glass, bounced off the wooden rim of the nightstand, and landed with a soft, hollow tap on the hardwood floor. It rolled straight toward my foot, stopping against the toe of my leather shoe. I picked it up. It was perfectly round, warm to the touch, and carried the faint, clean scent of the saltwater pool. Caspian, I said, my voice carrying over the quiet hum of the apartment's air filtration system. The cocoon of blankets on the hydrogel bed twitched. Slowly, the duvet parted. A pair of ice blue eyes peered out from the dark folds, blinking against the sudden intrusion of the overhead lights. Behind him, the silver tip of his tail Gave a tiny, cautious flick, rustling the silk of my favorite gray sweater. Did you dismantle my entire wardrobe while I was at work? I asked, walking over to the nest. With every step I took, the pearls underfoot crunched and rolled like gravel. There were easily thousands of them. He had filled the ceramic fruit bowl, my glass flower vases, 3 empty coffee mugs, and even the shallow tray where I usually kept my keys. The sheer monetary value sitting in my living room was enough to buy a modest townhouse, yet the perpetrator of this sudden wealth was currently trying to pull my winter trench coat over his head to hide from my gaze. Vivian, a muffled voice came from beneath the pile of wool and cashmere. I see you, I said, reaching down to gently tug at the hem of the duvet. Caspian held on tight. His physical strength, even when he was pretending to be a pathetic, shivering lump, was formidable. I felt the fabric strain, and rather than rip my expensive bedding, I let go with a sigh. You can't keep sleeping in my clothes, I said, sitting on the edge of the mattress. The cool, unstable gel shifted beneath me, making me feel slightly tilted. And what is all this? I gestured to the sea of pearls covering the floor. Are you trying to turn my apartment into a ball pit? Hearing my sigh, Caspian slowly emerged. He pushed the trench coat down to his collarbones, his dark, damp hair clinging to his forehead. He looked at me with those wide, liquid eyes, his lower lip trembling just a fraction. He looked incredibly small, despite the fact that if he stood up, his tail alone would span nearly 8 feet. He reached out from under the duvet, his pale hand trembling, and offered me another pearl. This one was slightly pink, reflecting the warm light of the lamp. No, I said, gently pushing his hand back. No more pearls. I have nowhere left to put them. I might have to start keeping them in the bathtub, which would make taking a shower very uncomfortable. Caspian's face fell. He looked down at the pearl in his palm, then at the empty glass cup beside him. With a small, unhappy click of his tongue, he dropped the pearl into his mouth. Don't swallow that. I lunged forward, grabbing his jaw. His eyes went wide with surprise, but he didn't struggle. He let me pinch his cheeks, parting his lips to show me the pearl resting safely on the middle of his tongue. His breath was cool, smelling faintly of the mint-flavored ice chips I had given him the night before. Spit, I ordered, holding my hand beneath his chin. He leaned forward, his wet eyelashes brushing against my knuckles as he spat the pearl back into my hand. But instead of pulling away, he kept his chin resting in my palm, his heavy eyelids drooping as he let out a soft, vibrating purr. The sound rumbled deep within his chest, a low frequency that I could feel directly through the bones of my hand. You are a menace, I muttered, though I didn't pull my hand away. I used my thumb to brush a stray strand of dark hair from his forehead. His skin was cool. Now, the terrifying fever of his dehydration completely gone thanks to his night in the pool. Are you hungry? At the word hungry, his ears, the delicate, webbed fins on the sides of his head, flared slightly. Salmon, he whispered, his English improving by the day, though his accent remained thick and liquid, as if he were trying to speak through a mouthful of water. Yes, salmon. But this time, we are not searing it. You're eating it raw, like a normal marine animal. My kitchen smells like a fish market, and I am tired of washing the grease off the stove. Caspian didn't seem to care about the preparation. He simply nodded, his eyes locked on mine with a level of devotion that felt entirely unearned. I stood up to go to the kitchen, but before I could take a step, his hand shot out from the blankets, wrapping firmly around my wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. His silver-scaled tail uncoiled from the nest, sliding across the gel mattress and draping over my ankles, anchoring me to the spot. Vivian, he murmured, his voice low and pleading. Stay. I have to get your food, Caspian. No, he said, shaking his head. He pulled my hand toward his chest, pressing my palm against the cool, smooth skin over his collarbone. Stay. Cold. You're not cold, you're just clingy, I said. But looking at the dark circles under his eyes and the faint, healing scars along his ribs, my chest tightened. He had been kept in a shipping crate for weeks, treated like defective cargo. It was no wonder he couldn't bear to let his only source of safety out of his sight. 10 minutes, I said, settling back onto the edge of the mattress. Then I'm getting the fish. Caspian let out a soft, victorious chirp, a sound like a small dolphin, and immediately dragged himself closer, resting his head on my lap. He closed his eyes, his silver tail giving a lazy, contented swish, scattering a few dozen more pearls across the floor. I looked at the glittering mess, then at the creature resting so peacefully against me, and felt a quiet, mounting dread. The scars on his body were fading. His silver scales were beginning to regain their iridescent sheen, reflecting a spectrum of blues and purples in the dim light. He was healing. And once he was fully healed, I would have to let him go. Over the next 2 weeks, the domestic routine of my apartment became entirely centered around Caspian's eccentricities. I had to buy a second refrigerator specifically to store his seafood. The customer service representative, Tiny, had become my primary source of survival advice. Our chat history was a bizarre mix of marine biology and domestic troubleshooting. Vivian, he refuses to sleep in the pool now. He only wants to sleep on the floor next to my bed, but he leaves a trail of damp slime on the hardwood. Is there a way to waterproof a merman? Tiny, oh, dear. That's just his natural protective mucus coating. It keeps his scales from drying out. Try putting down a thick tarp under his blankets, or better yet, let him sleep in your bed. The body heat of a human is highly therapeutic for recovering mermen. Sending hugs. Vivian, I am not letting an 8-foot aquatic predator sleep in my bed. He already stole my favorite sweater. Tiny, he's not stealing, dear. He's scent marking. It means he views you as his safe harbor. If you take the sweater back, he might think you're rejecting his presence, which could lead to severe depression or pearl hyperproduction. I stared at the screen, then looked over at the living room. Caspian was currently draped over the back of my sofa, his silver tail hanging off the side, slowly waving back and forth. He was wearing the gray wool sweater. It was far too small for his broad shoulders, the seams stretching precariously, but he looked so incredibly pleased with himself that I didn't have the heart to take it away. The pearl hyperproduction was a real concern. My apartment was rapidly running out of storage space. I had resorted to filling large plastic storage bins with them and stacking them in the hallway. I had briefly considered selling some, but a quick search online revealed that selling high-grade, chemically perfect pearls without a commercial fishing license or a proper importing permit would immediately attract the attention of the authorities. So, for now, I was a middle-class office worker living in a treasury of unsellable maritime wealth. Caspian, I called out, walking into the living room with a bowl of ice cubes. He immediately sat up, his ears perking. He slid off the sofa with a wet schluck sound, dragging his tail across the tarp I had eventually laid down over the hardwood. He stopped at my feet, looking up with an eager, expectant expression. Ice, he said, pronouncing the C with a sharp, clicking sound. Sit, I said. He lowered his upper body, resting his hands on my knees. I sat down on the armchair opposite him and held out an ice cube. Instead of taking it, he repeated the ritual we had established. He wrapped his cold, webbed fingers gently around my wrist, leaning in close. His soft lips brushed my palm as he took the ice cube, his sharp, pointed teeth scraping lightly against my skin. Crunch, crunch. He closed his eyes in bliss, the cold vapor rising from his mouth. Good? I asked. Good, he agreed, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. He opened his eyes, staring at my hand. More. I offered him another. This time, as he took it, his tongue brushed the center of my palm. A shiver ran down my spine, not just from the cold, but from the intense, unblinking focus in his ice-blue eyes. There was a primitive, wild intelligence behind that gaze, one that I often forgot existed when he was whining for seared salmon or nesting in my laundry. Once the ice was gone, he didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly, and he pulled my hand down toward his tail. Caspian? He didn't answer. He was looking incredibly anxious, his ears pinned flat against his head. With his other hand, he reached down to the thickest part of his tail, where the silver scales met his lower abdomen. Before I could stop him, he pinched a large, shimmering silver scale between his thumb and forefinger. With a sharp, sudden wrench, he tore it free. Stop. I gasped, lunging forward to grab his hand. What are you doing? Are you crazy? A tiny drop of dark, bluish-purple blood welled up from the empty socket on his tail. Caspian didn't even flinch. His expression was entirely solemn, his eyes wide and searching as he took my hand, forced my fingers open, and pressed the bloody, silver scale into my palm. For you, he whispered, his voice trembling. Vivian. For you. I don't want this. I said, my heart hammering in my chest. The scale was beautiful, larger than a silver dollar, shifting from brilliant blue to pearlescent white in the light. But the sight of the blood on his tail made my stomach turn. Why would you do that? Does it hurt? I grabbed a clean tissue from the table and pressed it against the small wound on his tail. Caspian watched me, his body perfectly still, his eyes tracking my every movement with a look of intense, agonizing anticipation. He looked as if his entire world depended on my reaction. "No," he murmured, his voice cracking. "No hurt. You keep?" "No, I am not keeping your body parts," I said, my voice sharper than intended. Due to my panic. "Why are you pulling your scales off? Is your skin dry? Is the pool not salty enough?" Caspian's ears drooped until they were almost flat against his neck. The bright, hopeful light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dull, profound despair. He looked down at the scale in my hand, then at the blood on the tissue, and let out a low, mournful whine that sounded like a dying wail. He pulled his hand back, curled his tail tightly around himself, and slid backward across the floor, retreating into the darkest corner of the room. He refused to look at me, burying his face in his arms. "Caspian," I said, walking over to him. "Talk to me. What's wrong?" He didn't move. A few minutes later, the soft, rhythmic plip-plop of pearls hitting the floor began again. Frustrated and deeply worried, I grabbed my phone and opened the chat window. "Vivian," Caspian just pulled one of his own scales out and gave it to me. "He's bleeding. Is this self-harm? Is he sick?" I waited, but the tiny icon remained gray. She was offline. I searched online forums for hours, typing in queries like "merman pulling out scales," "merman self-mutilation," and "why is my merman shedding?" Most of the results were highly unreliable, filled with urban legends and speculative fiction. But on one obscure marine conservation forum, I found a thread about captive mermen. User 7721, when kept in confined spaces, wild mermen will often display severe stress behaviors. This includes wall striking, refusing food, and self-plucking scales. If your specimen begins plucking, it is a sign of extreme psychological distress. They are rejecting their environment. If left untreated, they will eventually waste away. My heart sank. They are rejecting their environment. I looked over at Caspian. He was still curled in the corner, a small pile of pearls gathering around his tail. He looked so fragile, so utterly out of place. In this small, carpeted apartment with its artificial lights and plastic furniture. He was a creature of the open ocean. He belonged to the endless blue, the deep trenches, the wild currents. I had bought him on a whim, driven by a childhood memory and a discount link, thinking I was saving him. But in reality, I was just another jailer. I walked over to him, kneeling on the damp tarp. I didn't try to touch him, fearing I would only distress him further. "I'm sorry, Caspian," I whispered. "I'll make it right. I promise." He didn't look up, but his tail gave a tiny, weak twitch. The next morning, the apartment was unusually quiet. Usually, Caspian would be waiting by my bed, or at least splashing around in the pool, demanding his breakfast. But when I opened my bedroom door, the hallway was empty. The water in the indoor pool was perfectly still, the blue tiles reflecting the morning light. "Caspian?" I called out, a sudden spike of panic hitting my chest. Had he managed to escape? The windows were all locked, and the front door was deadbolt. I hurried to the living room. The nest of blankets on his hydrogel bed was empty. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, and even the large pantry, my breath coming faster. Then, I heard a strange, wet thud coming from my guest bedroom, a small room I mostly used for storage. I rushed to the door and pushed it open. The room was cluttered with cardboard boxes and old furniture. In the center of the floor, sitting amidst a pile of collapsed boxes, was a man. He was completely naked, his broad, pale back turned to me. His shoulders were muscular, his spine prominent, and where his magnificent silver tail should have been, there were two incredibly long, pale, and elegantly shaped human legs. "Caspian?" I gasped. The man flinched, turning his head. It was indeed Caspian. His face was the same, his ice blue eyes wide with a mixture of terror and triumph. But his body was entirely human now, save for the delicate, pale blue webbing between his fingers and the faint, shimmering scars on his thighs where his scales had once been. "Vivian," he gasped, his voice higher and more breathless than before. He tried to stand up, pushing his hands against the floor. But his new legs were weak, trembling like those of a newborn calf. He managed to lift himself a few inches before his knees buckled, and he collapsed back onto the floor with a painful-sounding groan. "Don't move," I cried, rushing into the room and kneeling beside him. I grabbed a nearby packing blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders, shielding his bare skin from the cold air. Caspian immediately clung to me, his arms wrapping around my neck with terrifying strength. He was shivering violently, his skin cold and clammy. "Legs," he whispered into my neck, his breath warm and rapid. "Vivian." Look. Legs. I see them, I said, my heart pounding. I remembered the manual's warning. Some mermen possess the ability to shift their tails into human legs. The shop is not responsible if your merman escapes using this method. Did he do this to escape? Was he so desperate to leave that he had forced his body to undergo this painful transformation? Why did you do this? I asked, my voice tight with emotion. You didn't have to force yourself. If you wanted to leave, you only had to tell me. Caspian pulled back slightly, looking at me with confusion. Leave? The ocean, I said, gesturing vaguely toward the window. You want to go back? That's why you were pulling your scales out, right? Because you were miserable. Here. Caspian stared at me, his brow furrowing as he tried to process my words. He looked down at his new legs, then back at me. He shook his head slowly, his expression growing desperate. No, he said, his English cracking under the strain. No leave. Legs, for Vivian. Walk. Stay. With you. I froze. What? No swim, Caspian said, pointing to his legs, then touching my own legs through my trousers. Same. Vivian and Caspian. Same. He thought that by turning into a human, he could stay with me. He had gone through the agony of shedding his scales and reshaping his entire skeleton just so we could be same. My chest felt incredibly tight, a strange, heavy warmth blooming behind my ribs. You idiot, I whispered, resting my forehead against his cool shoulder. You absolute idiot. Caspian didn't understand the insult, but he felt the change in my tone. He let out a soft, hesitant purr, his hands gently patting my back. Vivian, he murmured. No cry. I'm not crying, I said, though my eyes were suspiciously hot. I pulled back, looking at his ridiculous, beautiful face. Can you walk? Caspian looked down at his legs with a grim expression. He nodded slowly. Determined. With my support, he tried to stand again. I draped his arm over my shoulders, keeping my arm firmly around his waist. He was incredibly heavy, his muscle density far exceeding that of a normal human. Slowly, I guided him, one foot in front of the other. He took a step. His toes curled against the hardwood floor, his ankle wobbling precariously. He let out a sharp, frightened gasp, his grip on my shoulder tightening until I was sure I would have bruises. I've got you, I said. I won't let you fall. He looked down at me, his ice blue eyes filled with a fierce, burning intensity. No fall, he repeated. Vivian, hold. We managed to make it to the living room, a journey of 10 feet that took nearly 10 minutes. By the time I deposited him onto the sofa, we were both exhausted. I went to my closet and pulled out the largest pair of sweatpants I owned and an oversized hoodie. Getting Caspian into clothes was a comedic struggle. He didn't understand the concept of sleeves or pant legs, trying to put both legs into one hole and getting his head stuck in the hood. But eventually, he was dressed. He sat on the sofa, looking like a very large, very confused teenager in gray fleece. He kept staring at his feet, wiggling his toes with a look of profound fascination. You look ridiculous, I said, handing him a cup of ice. He took the ice, but this time, he didn't use his lips. He picked up a cube with his webbed fingers and popped it into his mouth, crunching contentedly. Vivian, he said, pointing to the television. What is? That's a TV. It shows pictures. Pictures, he repeated, nodding. For the rest of the day, Caspian remained on the sofa. He was remarkably quick at learning. By the afternoon, he had figured out how to use the remote control. Though he was terrified of the volume button, scrambling backward whenever the sound got too loud. But as the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the living room, my anxiety returned. He was human now, or at least pretending to be. But for how long? And at what cost to his health? The manual had said nothing about the physical toll of the transformation. His skin was already looking drier than usual, and he kept rubbing his chest as if his lungs were struggling with the dry apartment air. I looked at the silver scale he had given me, which I had placed on the coffee table. It caught the last rays of the sun, glowing like a dying ember. He belonged to the sea. Even if he wanted to stay, even if he loved the ice cubes and the television and my sweaters, he was a wild creature. Keeping him here, forcing him to adapt to a world he wasn't made for, was selfish. I made my decision. Caspian, I said, sitting beside him. He turned to me, his eyes bright. Vivian? Tomorrow, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. We are going to the ocean. The drive to the coast was silent. Caspian sat in the passenger seat of my sedan, his knees pressed against the dashboard due to his height. He was staring out the window, his eyes wide as we. Past the sprawling suburbs, the concrete highways, and finally, the open, rolling green hills that led to the sea. He was wearing my oversized black hoodie and the gray sweatpants. He had his hands tucked into the front pocket, his shoulders hunched. He looked calm, almost serene, as if he believed we were simply going on another adventure. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I had chosen a secluded cove about 2 hours north of the city. It was a marine reserve, free of commercial fishing boats and tourists. The water there was deep, clean, and connected directly to the open ocean currents. It was the perfect place for him to transition back. When the car finally climbed the last hill, the endless expanse of the blue Pacific came into view. Caspian let out a soft, sharp gasp. He pressed his face against the glass, his nostrils flaring. The latent instinct within him was waking up, I could see it. In the way his ears flared and the way his pupils dilated, drinking in the sight of the water. Ocean, he whispered. Yes, I said, my throat dry. The ocean. I parked the car in a gravel lot near the trailhead. The air was cool and salty, carrying the sharp, brisk scent of seaweed and wet sand. I got out of the car, and Caspian followed. His walking had improved significantly. He no longer wobbled, though his gait remained slightly wide and heavy, like a sailor who hadn't quite adjusted to dry land. We walked down the narrow, sandy path to the beach. The waves were crashing against the black rocks, throwing white spray into the air. Caspian stopped at the water's edge. The wet sand sank beneath his bare feet. He closed his eyes, tilting his head back to inhale the sea breeze. A look of pure, instinctual relief washed over his face. This was where he belonged. Not in a plastic-lined indoor pool, not on a hydrogel mattress. Here. Caspian, I said, standing a few feet behind him. He turned to look at me, a brilliant, beautiful smile on his face. He reached out his hand, his fingers curling in a silent invitation. Vivian. Come. Water. No, I said, shaking my head. I kept my hands in my pockets, refusing to take his hand. If I took it now, I wouldn't be able to let go. I can't go with you. Caspian's smile faltered. His hand remained suspended in the air. No. You need to go back, I said, forcing my voice to remain calm, devoid of the emotion that was currently tearing my chest apart. Your wounds are healed. You don't need to stay in the apartment anymore. You don't need to force yourself to have legs. He stared at me, his ice blue eyes searching my face for any sign of a joke. But I kept my expression blank, neutral, like a detached pet owner returning an animal to the wild. Go, I said, pointing to the waves. Go home, Caspian. He took a step toward me, his hands trembling. No. Vivian is home. I am a human, Caspian. I live in the city. You are a merman. You belong in the sea. I pulled his silver scale out of my pocket and held it out to him. Take this back. I can't keep it. The moment he saw the scale in my hand, something broke inside him. His eyes went wide with a look of absolute, crushing betrayal. He didn't take the scale. Instead, he took a step back, his knees shaking. You, no want, he whispered, his voice cracking, sounding incredibly small against the roar of the surf. It's not that I don't want it, I lied, my voice trembling. But you shouldn't have pulled it out. You belong in the ocean. Go. Caspian looked at the sea, then at me. Suddenly, he fell to his knees in the wet sand. And then, he burst into tears. It wasn't a soft, quiet weep. It was a loud, desperate, heartbreaking sob. He covered his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently. And as he cried, the tears hitting the sand immediately solidified. Clatter, clatter, clatter. Dozens of perfect, shimmering pearls poured from his eyes, rolling into the foam of the crashing waves, lost to the tide. Caspian, please, I said, kneeling beside him, my own resolve crumbling. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but he violently flinched away, scrambling backward into the shallow water. Giving you my scales. He sobbed, his voice suddenly loud, his English remarkably clear as if fueled by sheer, desperate rage. Giving you my scales was a courtship ritual. Courtship. I froze. What? Courtship, he screamed, his chest heaving, his webbed hands clutching his wet hair. In the sea. We give scales to the one we want. We give pearls to the one we love. I give you everything. My body. My heart. My legs. He pointed a shaking, wet finger at me, his eyes red and brimming with endless tears. For heaven's sake, he cried, his voice echoing over the roar of the wind. You didn't release me. You abandoned me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The scales. The nesting. The pearls. It wasn't stress-induced self-mutilation. It wasn't captivity psychosis. It was love. He hadn't been trying to escape. He had been trying to marry me. And I had just driven him to the edge of the ocean and told him to get lost. Caspian, I gasped, my heart stopping. I didn't know. The manual didn't say. You never ask, he wept, his voice cracking. You just throw me in pool. You say dehydrated. I was happy. I wanted to be close. But you throw me away. He was right. I had been so convinced of my own logical, human explanations that I had completely ignored what he was actually trying to tell me. I had treated him like a pet, a project, a fragile wild animal, while he had been offering me his entire soul. As he sat there in the shallow surf, the cold salt water began to react with his skin. With a sharp, shimmering flash of light, his long, pale human legs began to dissolve, the skin fusing together, the silver scales rapidly crawling up his thighs. The transformation was happening in reverse, forced by his raw emotion and the touch of the sea. Within seconds, his magnificent silver tail was back, splashing weakly in the wet sand. He looked down at his tail, then up at me, his face pale and wet with tears. You don't love Caspian, he whispered, his voice returning to that low, resonant merman tone, thick with sorrow. You only want cheap companion. He turned away from me, dragging his heavy tail into the deeper water. Caspian, wait. I cried, running into the surf. The cold water instantly soaked my shoes and trousers, the heavy current pulling at my legs. But I didn't care. I lunged forward, throwing my arms around his broad, wet shoulders just as he was about to dive into the deep. Let go, he rumbled, his tail giving a warning slap against the water. No. I screamed, holding on with everything I had. My face was pressed against his wet neck, the scent of salt and rain filling my senses. I'm not letting go. I was wrong. I'm an idiot, Caspian. I didn't understand. He went still, his body tense beneath my grip. I don't want a cheap companion, I whispered, my tears finally spilling over, mixing with the salt water on his skin. I don't care about the pearls. I don't care about the scales. I want you. I want you in my apartment, stealing my sweaters, making a mess on my floor, eating my terrible salmon. I want you. Caspian remained perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. The waves crashed around us, soaking us both to the bone. Slowly, his silver tail stopped fighting the current. He turned his head, his ice blue eyes resting on my face. He looked incredibly vulnerable, his wet eyelashes clumped together, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. Vivian, no lie, he whispered. No lie, I said, wiping a tear from his cheek. I swear. Please, come back with me. He looked at my wet clothes, then at the shore where my car was parked, and finally back to my face. A single pearl, small and perfectly round, rolled down his cheek and fell into my open palm. Vivian, he murmured, his voice soft and incredibly sweet. Hold. I'm holding, I said, wrapping my arms tighter around his neck. With a soft, happy sigh, Caspian rested his chin on my shoulder. His tail gave a gentle, contented swish in the water, sending a spray of seafoam over us. Getting a wet, 8-foot merman with a fully restored silver tail back into the passenger seat of a mid-sized sedan was an absolute nightmare. We had to wait until dark so no one would see us. Caspian had to lie across the back seat, his magnificent tail sticking out of the rear window, wrapped in 3 separate trash bags to prevent his protective mucus from ruining the leather. Every time we stopped at a red light, I had to pray that no one looked too closely at the shimmering, silver mass occupying my back seat. But we made it. When we finally unlocked the door to the apartment, Caspian slid out of the car and dragged himself through the front door, looking completely exhausted but incredibly pleased. He didn't go to the pool. He didn't go to his hydrogel mattress. He crawled straight to my bedroom, dragged my heavy duvet onto the floor, and began meticulously rebuilding his nest. I stood in the doorway, damp, shivering, and smelling like a fish market, watching him. He looked up from his work, holding my favorite black sweater in his hands. He paused, then looked at me with a sheepish, tentative expression. Keep, he asked. I let out a soft, tired laugh. I walked over, sat down in the center of the nest, and pulled the blanket over my shoulders. Yes, Caspian. Keep. His eyes lit up. He immediately dragged his massive silver tail into the nest, curling it around my legs to lock me in place. He leaned forward, resting his heavy head against my chest, his cool skin acting as a perfect, natural cooling pad against the warmth of the duvet. I reached down, my fingers finding the small, empty socket on his tail where he had pulled the scale. The skin was already healing, the new scale beginning to bud like a tiny silver leaf. Don't ever do that again, I whispered, kissing the top of his damp head. I like your scales exactly where they are. Caspian let out a deep, vibrating purr, his body relaxing completely against mine. Vivian, he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. Yes? Love. I smiled, closing my eyes as the quiet, rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the room. Love you too, Caspian. Outside, the city hummed with its usual, chaotic energy. But inside this small, carpeted room, surrounded by piles of unsellable pearls and damp wool sweaters, the tide had finally come in. And for the first time in my life, I was perfectly content to drown.